The night in Ouagadougou hung heavy with an unnatural silence, as if nature itself had held its breath before an approaching storm. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's convoy had departed from the presidential palace under the veil of darkness, officially headed toward the eastern border on what was described as a classified intelligence mission. It was an operation known only to a handful of trusted officers, or so Ibrahim believed. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that among those very officers, some had already switched allegiances. The protectors who once served as his shield were now preparing to become his executioners, bought and paid for by foreign powers who feared the rising influence of Burkina Faso's young leader. As the convoy penetrated deeper into the forest, moonlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dancing shadows across Ibrahim's weathered face. He was a soldier's soldier, trained to read the subtle signs of danger, and something in the air felt wrong. The silence among his men was too complete, too deliberate. Usually, there would be radio chatter, occasional laughter, the camaraderie that bound soldiers together. Tonight, there was nothing but the rumble of engines and the weight of unspoken tension. Ibrahim's eyes swept across the faces of his men. One soldier kept averting his gaze. Another gripped his weapon with white knuckles, his jaw clenched too tightly. These were tells that any experienced commander would recognize the physical manifestations of guilt and nervous anticipation. The soldier within Ibrahim stirred to full alertness. He shifted in his seat, his hand moving subtly closer to his sidearm. "Where exactly are we heading?" he asked, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. No one answered. The only response was the continued growl of the engine and the crunch of tires on the rough forest road. In that moment, Ibrahim knew with absolute certainty that he had been betrayed. The vehicle lurched to a sudden stop. Before Ibrahim could react, before his fingers could close around the grip of his weapon, a devastating blow struck him from behind. Pain exploded through his skull, and the world dissolved into darkness. Consciousness returned slowly, accompanied by waves of throbbing pain. Ibrahim's first sensation was of the rough texture of rope cutting into his wrists. His arms were pulled taut behind him, bound to something solid and unyielding. As his vision cleared, he realized he was tied to an acacia tree, its thorny branches spreading above him like skeletal fingers reaching toward the star-filled sky. The ropes had been tied with cruel efficiency, biting deep into his flesh. Blood had dried in dark streaks along his forearms where the fibers had torn through skin. His throat was parched, his tongue thick and useless in his mouth. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he tested the bonds, but they held firm. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast wilderness of shadows and hidden dangers. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the distant whoop of hyenas, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush, the occasional screech of a night bird. Each sound reminded him of his vulnerability, of how far he was from civilization and help. As his mind cleared, the faces of his betrayers flashed before him. Officers he had personally promoted, men he had called brothers, soldiers he had trusted with his life. Some he had mentored from their earliest days in the military, shaping them into the leaders they had become. And now those same men had delivered him to this fate, leaving him to die in the wilderness so that foreign powers could rest, assured that Burkina Faso's lion had been silenced forever. But Ibrahim Traoré was not a man who accepted defeat easily. Even as pain coursed through his body, even as thirst and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, the warrior spirit within him refused to submit. His military training kicked in, that survival instinct that had been honed through years of conflict and hardship. Observe, think, survive, he whispered to himself, the mantra he had taught countless soldiers over the years. He forced himself to assess his situation with cold, analytical precision. The ropes were thick and professionally tied, but rope could be weakened. The tree was sturdy, but its bark was rough enough to potentially fray the fibers if he could position himself correctly. The night was dark, but the moon provided enough light to see his immediate surroundings. As he cataloged these details, A sound split the night, a roar so deep and powerful that it seemed to shake the very earth beneath him. It was the unmistakable call of a lion, the apex predator of the African savanna, announcing its presence to the world. Most men, tied and helpless in the darkness with a lion nearby, would have felt nothing but terror. But something unexpected stirred within Ibrahim's chest. Instead of fear, he felt an odd sense of recognition, almost like anticipation. It was as if some instinct deeper than conscious thought recognized this roar not as a harbinger of death, but as a call from destiny itself. The silence that followed the lion's roar was somehow more terrifying than the sound itself. It was the silence of a predator on the hunt, moving with deadly purpose through the darkness. Ibrahim's breath came in shallow gasps as he strained to hear any indication of where the creature was, which direction it might be approaching from. Then, gradually, the sounds came. The whisper of grass being disturbed, the snap of a twig, heavy, measured footsteps that spoke of immense weight and power. Whatever was approaching was taking its time, confident in its dominance of this realm. The moonlight caught a pair of eyes first, golden, luminous, and fixed upon him with unwavering intensity. They held intelligence, curiosity, and something else that Ibrahim couldn't quite identify. As the creature emerged from the shadows, Ibrahim's breath caught in his throat. It was a magnificent male lion, perhaps the largest he had ever seen. Its mane was thick and luxurious, catching the moonlight and seeming to glow with an almost supernatural radiance. The muscles beneath its tawny coat rippled with each movement, testament to years of survival in one of nature's most unforgiving arenas. This was no ordinary animal. This was a king in his domain, and Ibrahim was completely at his mercy. The lion approached slowly, its massive paws making almost no sound despite their size. It circled Ibrahim, its nose working to catch his scent, analyzing this strange situation. Ibrahim could feel the heat radiating from the beast's body, could smell the musky odor of its fur mixed with the metallic tang of old blood. This was a predator in its prime, capable of killing him with a single swipe of those massive paws. But as the lion circled, something caught Ibrahim's eye. On the lion's left shoulder, partially hidden by the thick mane, was a scar, old but distinctive. It was a jagged line, the kind of wound that came from a bullet, stitched together with the rough healing of wilderness medicine. Ibrahim's heart nearly stopped. Memory flooded back with crystalline clarity. 3 months ago, Ibrahim had been on a different kind of mission, surveying the borderlands for signs of rebel activity. His small team had come across a scene of carnage. Poachers had attacked a pride of lions, killing several for their body parts to be sold on the black market. Among the casualties, they had found a lioness, grievously wounded but still alive, protected by her mate who refused to leave her side despite his own injuries. The male lion had been shot, the bullet lodging in his shoulder. He was weakened by blood loss and unable to hunt, staying by his mate's side even as death approached. Ibrahim, who had always held a deep respect for wildlife, couldn't simply walk away. Against the advice of his men, he had ordered them to tranquilize both lions. Using the limited medical supplies they carried, Ibrahim himself had extracted the bullet, cleaned the wounds, and stitched them closed as best he could with field surgical techniques. They had stayed with the lions for 2 days, ensuring they regained enough strength to survive. Ibrahim had personally brought them water and even arranged for meat to be brought from a nearby village. When the lions were finally able to stand and move under their own power, Ibrahim had ordered his men to clear out, giving the animals space to return to their territory. He had released them back into the wild, expecting never to see them again. It had been an act of compassion, nothing more, a brief moment of humanity in a world that often seemed devoid of it. Now, standing before him in the moonlight, was that same lion. The scar on its shoulder was unmistakable proof. "It's you," Ibrahim whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "You're the one I saved." The lion's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. It stopped circling and stood directly in front of him, those golden eyes boring into his own. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, the lion lowered its massive head and sniffed at the ropes binding Ibrahim's wrists. Ibrahim's mind raced. Was this recognition? Could the lion possibly remember? Animals had long memories, especially for those who had helped them. But could this creature truly understand that the man before him was the same one who had saved its life months ago? The lion's behavior suggested it did. Instead of the aggressive posturing of a predator sizing up prey, there was curiosity, almost gentleness in its movements. It sniffed the ropes again, then looked up at Ibrahim's face as if asking a question. A smile, painful and cracked, formed on Ibrahim's lips. "Yes, my friend," he said softly. "I remember you too." Just as this moment of recognition passed between man and beast, the night air carried a new sound, one that chilled Ibrahim's blood. It was the eerie, cackling laughter of hyenas, those opportunistic scavengers who hunted in packs and feared nothing when they had numbers on their side. From the darkness emerged a dozen pairs of gleaming eyes, low to the ground and spreading out to surround them. The hyenas had caught the scent of blood and vulnerability. They saw an easy meal, a helpless human, and a single lion who might be driven off if they pressed their advantage. The male lion's entire demeanor changed in an instant. Where there had been gentle curiosity, now there was fierce determination. He positioned himself directly between Ibrahim and the approaching hyenas, his body becoming a living shield. His ears flattened against his skull, and a low, rumbling growl began to build in his chest, a sound that spoke of raw power and absolute resolve. Ibrahim realized with a shock of emotion what was happening. This lion, who owed him nothing beyond the debt of life once saved, was now preparing to defend him. Against overwhelming odds, injured and alone, this magnificent creature was choosing to stand and fight rather than abandon the human who had once helped him. "No," Ibrahim said urgently, though he knew the lion couldn't understand his words. "Run, save yourself. You don't owe me this." But the lion's response was to dig his claws deeper into the earth and release a roar that shook leaves from the trees. It was a declaration, a challenge, and a promise all at once. "This human is under my protection." The hyenas hesitated. They were intelligent enough to recognize a determined defender, and a male lion at his peak was a formidable opponent even for a pack. But hunger and the scent of blood made them bold. They began their approach, spreading wider to attack from multiple angles, their standard pack hunting tactic. The first hyena darted forward, testing the lion's reflexes. The response was lightning fast. The lion's paw shot out in a blur of motion, catching the hyena across its flank and sending it tumbling with a yelp of pain. Two more rushed in from different angles, and the lion spun with surprising agility for such a large animal, teeth bared and claws extended. What followed was a brutal ballet of violence. The lion fought with the desperate ferocity of a protector defending something precious. He couldn't afford to chase any single opponent. That would leave Ibrahim vulnerable to attack from the others. Instead, he maintained his position, a whirlwind of teeth and claws that punished any hyena foolish enough to come within range. Ibrahim watched in awe and horror. Blood sprayed in the moonlight, some of it from the hyenas, but some from the lion as well. A particularly bold attacker had managed to sink its teeth into the lion's haunch before being shaken off and driven back. Another had raked claws across the lion's shoulder, reopening the old wound Ibrahim had once treated. But the lion didn't falter. If anything, the pain seemed to fuel his determination. He was no longer just fighting for survival. He was fighting for honor, for loyalty, for the bond that had been formed that day months ago when a human had shown him mercy. Gradually, the tide turned. The hyenas, despite their numbers, were taking too many casualties. Several lay motionless on the ground, while others limped away, whimpering. The pack's coordination began to break down as individual survival instinct overcame collective hunting strategy. One by one, they retreated into the darkness, their cackles fading into the distance until only silence remained. The lion stood panting heavily, his sides heaving with exertion. Blood matted his golden coat and fresh wounds added to his collection of scars. But he had won. He had protected his charge. He turned to look at Ibrahim, and in those golden eyes was a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. The look seemed to say, "We survived." Together. Ibrahim felt tears streaming down his face, mixing with the dirt and dried blood. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, brother." With the immediate danger past, the lion turned his attention back to Ibrahim's bonds. He sniffed at the ropes again, this time with more purpose. His massive head tilted as he examined how the ropes were tied, where they were weakest, where they might be severed. Ibrahim marveled at the intelligence on display. This wasn't just instinct. This was problem-solving, the application of reasoning to a novel situation. The lion understood that Ibrahim needed to be freed, and it was trying to figure out how to accomplish that goal. "The knots are too complex," Ibrahim said, partly to himself and partly to the lion. "But if you can weaken the rope itself, maybe at that spot where the bark has already started to fray it." He gestured with his eyes toward a section of the rope where it crossed a particularly rough patch of the acacia tree's bark. Hours of his struggling had caused some of the fibers to split and separate. It wasn't much, but it might be enough if they could work together. The lion followed his gaze, and Ibrahim could have sworn he saw understanding flash in those golden eyes. The great beast moved to that exact spot, lowering his head to examine the weakened section of rope more closely. Then, with surprising delicacy for such a powerful creature, the lion opened his jaws and carefully positioned the rope between his teeth. Ibrahim held his breath. Those jaws could crush bone, could sever a rope or a human arm with terrifying ease. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and this attempt at rescue could end in disaster. But the lion's control was remarkable. He applied pressure gradually, testing the rope's resistance. When it didn't immediately give way, he adjusted his grip and tried again. Ibrahim could feel the tension in the rope changing, could sense the fibers beginning to separate under the sustained pressure. "Easy," Ibrahim murmured. "Just a little more." The lion's eyes met his, and in that moment, there was perfect communication between them despite the barrier of species. They were partners in this endeavor, working toward a common goal with mutual trust. The rope creaked. Some fibers snapped with audible pops. The lion repositioned, found a slightly different angle, and bit down again. More fibers gave way. Ibrahim added his own effort, straining against his bonds, using his weight to add stress to the weakened section. A sound in the distance interrupted their work. Another roar, but this one from multiple throats. The lion's head snapped up, ears swiveling to pinpoint the direction. His body tensed, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. More lions were approaching. Whether they were members of the same pride or a rival group, their presence represented a new potential threat. The lion redoubled his efforts on the rope, working with increased urgency. He bit, pulled, and twisted. Ibrahim threw all his remaining strength into straining against the bonds. The combined effort finally proved too much for the damaged rope. With a sharp crack, it gave way. Ibrahim's right hand came free, numb and tingling from restricted circulation but gloriously mobile. He immediately went to work on the remaining bonds, his fingers clumsy but determined. The lion stood guard, watching the darkness for signs of the approaching pride. Within minutes, Ibrahim had freed himself completely. He collapsed to his knees, his legs unable to support him after so many hours of constraint. The lion moved closer, pressing his warm bulk against Ibrahim's side, offering support. Ibrahim wrapped his arm around the lion's neck, burying his face in that thick mane for just a moment. "You saved me," he whispered. "A beast with more humanity than the men who betrayed me." The approaching roars grew louder. From the shadows emerged a new pride, 5 lionesses and 2 younger males, all in their prime. Their eyes gleamed with territorial aggression and predatory interest. They had followed the sounds of the earlier fight with the hyenas, drawn by the promise of an easy meal or the chance to eliminate a rival. Ibrahim's lion immediately stepped in front of him again, despite his wounds and exhaustion. But this time the odds were far worse. 8 against 1, with the defending lion already weakened by his previous battle. It seemed an impossible fight. Yet the lion didn't hesitate. He released another thunderous roar, this one filled with defiance and warning. It was a sound that spoke of dominance, of territory, of unbreakable will. His message was clear. This human is under my protection. You will have to go through me. The rival pride paused, assessing this unexpected resistance. They could see the fresh wounds, could smell the blood. Logic said this should be an easy victory, but something in the defending lion's stance, in the fire of his eyes, gave them pause. The largest of the rival males, his mane thick and dark, stepped forward to issue his own challenge. The two males faced each other, and the air between them crackled with tension. This was more than just a fight for food. This was a test of dominance, a clash of wills that would determine the outcome. Ibrahim, still weak but determined, grabbed a fallen branch and struggled to his feet. If this was to be their final stand, he would face it standing, fighting alongside the creature who had shown him such extraordinary loyalty. The rival male charged first. The two lions collided with bone-shaking force, a tangle of teeth and claws and raw power. They rolled across the ground, each seeking the grip that would end the fight. The lionesses circled, looking for an opening to join the attack. Ibrahim swung his makeshift club at the nearest lioness, surprising her enough to make her back off. "Come on!" he shouted, adrenaline overriding his exhaustion. "Is this all you've got?" The defending lion fought with everything he had left. Despite his wounds, despite the exhaustion, he matched the rival male blow for blow. More than that, he fought with a fury born of purpose. He wasn't just defending territory or establishing dominance. He was protecting his friend, honoring a debt, living up to a bond that transcended the natural order. The other male, for all his strength, was fighting for pride and instinct. But Ibrahim's lion was fighting for something more powerful: loyalty. The tide of the battle shifted. The defending lion managed to get his jaws around the rival's throat, not a killing grip, but a submission hold. He applied just enough pressure to make his point clear: yield or die. The rival male, sensing his disadvantage and reading the absolute determination in his opponent's eyes, made the wise choice. He went still, signaling surrender. Slowly, Ibrahim's lion released him. The defeated male scrambled backward, dignity wounded but life intact. He glanced at his pride, then at the battered but undefeated defender, and made a decision. With a snort, he turned and led his pride back into the forest. They had won. Impossibly, against all odds, they had won. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The long night was finally ending, and with it came a bittersweet realization. It was time for their paths to diverge. Ibrahim knelt before the lion, whose breathing was labored and whose coat was matted with blood from multiple wounds. Despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, there was peace in those golden eyes. "I need to go back," Ibrahim said softly, knowing the lion couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. "My people need me. My country needs me. But I will never forget what you've done for me." The lion lowered his massive head, and Ibrahim placed both hands on either side of it, looking directly into those eyes that had seen so much in the past hours. "You are more than just an animal," Ibrahim continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a reminder of what true loyalty looks like. You're proof that honor and courage aren't the exclusive domain of humans. You've taught me that the greatest strength isn't in weapons or armies, but in keeping one's promises and standing by those who have stood by you." The lion made a soft, rumbling sound deep in his chest. Not a growl, but something gentler, almost like a purr. He pressed his head more firmly into Ibrahim's hands. For several minutes, they stayed like that, man and beast, sharing a moment of connection that few would ever experience or understand. The barriers of species fell away, leaving only the pure essence of mutual respect and affection. Finally, Ibrahim stood. His legs were steadier now, his determination rekindled by the lion's example. "I have to make sure your sacrifice wasn't in vain," he said. "I have to go back and fix what's broken in my country. I have to build something worthy of the second chance you've given me." The lion seemed to understand that this was goodbye. He rose to his feet, shook his magnificent mane, and looked toward the lightening east. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. A new day was beginning. Ibrahim began walking, each step taking him closer to civilization and further from this magical, terrible night. After a dozen paces, he stopped and looked back. The lion still stood there, silhouetted against the rising sun, a regal figure that seemed to embody everything noble about the wild. Their eyes met one last time across the distance. Then the lion turned and walked in the opposite direction, disappearing into the forest that was his domain. Ibrahim watched until the last glimpse of golden mane vanished among the trees. "Goodbye, my brother," he whispered to the empty air. "May God protect you as you protected me." It took Ibrahim 3 days to make his way back to civilization. He walked through the wilderness, using his military training to navigate by the sun and stars, foraging for food and water when he could find it. His body was a map of pain, cuts, bruises, dehydration, and exhaustion all taking their toll. But his spirit was stronger than it had ever been. Each step was driven by purpose. He had been given a second chance at life, and he was determined not to waste it. The lion's loyalty, its willingness to fight and sacrifice for someone who had once shown it kindness, had become a beacon lighting his way forward. On the 3rd day, he stumbled upon a rural village. The people there were initially frightened by this bloodied, ragged figure emerging from the forest. But when they recognized who he was, word spread like wildfire. Within hours, a military helicopter arrived to bring him back to Ouagadougou. The capital was in turmoil. Rumors had spread of the president's death, of a military coup, of foreign invasion. Chaos had begun to take root in the power vacuum. But when Ibrahim's helicopter touched down at the presidential palace, when he emerged alive and unbroken, it was as if the entire nation released a collective breath it had been holding. The first order of business was dealing with the traitors. The officers who had betrayed him were rounded up within hours, their guilt written clearly in their shocked faces when they saw Ibrahim alive. Some had already begun positioning themselves for power, certain their conspiracy had succeeded. But Ibrahim surprised everyone with his response to the betrayal. There was no public execution, no torture, no revenge killings. Instead, he ordered fair trials, proper legal proceedings. "We will not defeat corruption and betrayal by becoming corrupt and treacherous ourselves," he declared. "The lion who saved me in the forest showed me that true strength lies in honor, not vengeance. The trials were swift but just." The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions numerous. Foreign connections were exposed, revealing a plot that went far deeper than a simple military coup. International interests, threatened by Burkina Faso's growing independence and resource nationalism, had orchestrated the entire conspiracy. As the guilty were sentenced, Ibrahim addressed the nation. Thousands gathered in the capital square, while millions more watched on television and listened on radio throughout Burkina Faso and beyond. Ibrahim stood before his people, the wounds on his body still visible, a living testament to what he had survived. The crowd was silent, waiting. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice strong despite everything he had endured. "You have heard the rumors of my death. You have seen the chaos that threatened to tear our nation apart. But I stand before you today not because of military might or political maneuvering. I stand here because of a lesson I learned in the wilderness, a lesson taught to me by a lion." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "A lion? What was he talking about?" Ibrahim continued. 3 months ago, I helped save the life of a wounded lion and its mate. It was a simple act of compassion, the kind that any decent person should be willing to perform. I expected nothing in return. I thought I would never see those animals again." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled masses. "But when I was betrayed by men I called brothers, when I was left tied to a tree to die in that same wilderness, that lion found me. And instead of seeing a helpless meal, it recognized the human who had once helped it. That lion spent an entire night protecting me, fighting off hyenas, defending me from other predators, and ultimately helping me free myself." The crowd was utterly silent now, hanging on every word. "A beast," Ibrahim said, his voice rising with passion. "An animal that supposedly operates only on instinct and hunger, showed me more loyalty and honor than trained soldiers, than men who swore oaths of allegiance. That lion was wounded protecting me. It risked its life for mine. Not because it had to, not because it would gain anything, but because it remembered kindness, and it chose to repay that kindness. Tears streamed down the faces of many in the crowd. If a lion can remember compassion, Ibrahim continued, if a wild predator can demonstrate loyalty and courage, then how much more should we expect from ourselves? We are humans, blessed with reason and moral choice. We have the capacity not just for survival instinct, but for conscious ethics, for deliberate honor. He raised his fist to the sky. From this day forward, Burkina Faso will be guided by the principles that Lion demonstrated in the wilderness. Loyalty to those who stand by us, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, honor in all our dealings, gratitude for kindness received, and the strength to protect what is right, even when it costs us dearly. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause and cheers. Traoré, Traoré! The Lion of Burkina Faso. In the months and years that followed, Ibrahim Traoré transformed his near-death experience into a driving force for national renewal. The story of the lion spread throughout Burkina Faso and beyond, becoming a parable for a new kind of leadership, one based not on military might alone, but on reciprocal loyalty, respect for all life, and the courage to stand by one's principles. Ibrahim commissioned a monument in the capital square, a bronze statue of a lion and a man standing side by side, equals in dignity and courage. Beneath it, an inscription in multiple languages read, "True strength lies not in dominating others, but in upholding honor. True leadership is not taking from the people, but giving to them, even at great personal cost." He reformed the military, rooting out corruption and instilling new values. Officers were trained not just in combat tactics, but in ethics, in the responsibilities of power, in the difference between authority and authoritarianism. Be like the lion became an unofficial motto, fierce when necessary, but also noble, loyal, and protective of those in your care. Foreign relations shifted as well. Ibrahim spoke openly about the assassination attempt and the foreign interests behind it. He called for a new African unity, one that wouldn't bow to neo-colonial pressures or allow outside powers to exploit internal divisions. They thought leaving me to die would make us weak, he said. Instead, it made us understand our own strength. Environmental conservation became a priority. New protections were established for wildlife, with particular emphasis on lion populations. Ibrahim personally funded anti-poaching efforts and worked to create corridors where wildlife could move safely. "We owe a debt to nature," he often said, "and I intend to pay it." But perhaps his most significant legacy was in the realm of justice and reconciliation. While the traitors who had betrayed him were punished according to law, Ibrahim also established truth and reconciliation processes. He understood that betrayal often grew from desperation, from corruption, from systems that failed people. Simply punishing individuals wouldn't fix broken systems. "The lion didn't kill the hyenas that attacked us," he explained to his advisors. "It drove them away, defended what needed defending, but didn't seek excessive vengeance. There's wisdom in that. We must be fierce against injustice, but we must also be wise enough to build something better than cycles of revenge." 2 years after that fateful night, Ibrahim returned to the forest. He came with a small team of conservationists and researchers, not for politics or publicity, but for personal reasons. He needed to know if the lion had survived, if his friend was still out there. They spent days in the wilderness, tracking lion populations, documenting their movements and health. Ibrahim felt a sense of peace in the forest that he rarely experienced in the presidential palace. Here, among the trees and wildlife, the concerns of politics and power seemed distant and small. On the 5th day, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, they found a pride of lions resting in a clearing. The researchers began their observations, cataloging individuals, noting behaviors. But Ibrahim's attention was fixed on one particular male. He was older now, his mane shot through with gray but still powerfully built. And on his shoulder, clearly visible even at a distance, was the distinctive scar. Ibrahim's heart leaped. Against all odds, against the dangers of the wild, his friend had survived and thrived. The lion was surrounded by lionesses and cubs, a successful pride leader who had passed on his genes to a new generation. As if sensing the intensity of Ibrahim's gaze, the lion's head turned. Their eyes met across the clearing, and for a moment time seemed to stop. Did the lion recognize him after all this time? Could that bond still exist after 2 years? Slowly, carefully, Ibrahim began walking toward the pride. His team called out warnings, but he waved them off. He knew this was dangerous, knew he was taking an enormous risk, but he had to know. The lionesses tensed, watching this human approach. The cubs scurried behind their mothers, but the male lion simply watched, golden eyes unblinking. Ibrahim stopped about 20 meters away, close enough to see clearly, far enough to hopefully give the lion space. He stood there, unarmed and vulnerable, just as he had been that night 2 years ago. The lion rose to his feet. The pride watched their leader, waiting for his signal. Would he attack? Drive away this intruder? Or... The great cat walked forward, each step measured and deliberate. Ibrahim's heart pounded in his chest, but he held his ground, hands at his sides, posture non-threatening. The lion stopped directly in front of him, so close that Ibrahim could feel the warmth of his breath. They looked at each other, man and beast, leader and leader. Then, gently, the lion lowered his massive head and pressed it against Ibrahim's chest, just as he had done that dawn 2 years ago. The same rumbling purr emanated from deep within his chest. Ibrahim raised his hands and placed them on either side of the lion's head, fingers sinking into that magnificent mane. Tears ran freely down his face. "Hello, old friend," he whispered. "I've missed you." They stood like that for several minutes, while Ibrahim's team watched in stunned silence, cameras forgotten. This was a moment beyond documentation, beyond scientific observation. This was proof that bonds can transcend species, that loyalty and love are not exclusively human traits. Finally, the lion pulled back. He looked at Ibrahim one last time, and if an animal could smile, that lion was smiling. Then he turned and walked back to his pride, settling among his lionesses and cubs, his duty complete. Ibrahim watched him go, his heart full of gratitude and joy. His friend was safe, happy, surrounded by family. Their debt to each other had been paid in full, but the connection would last forever. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and the lion became more than just a tale of survival or an interesting anecdote. It became a foundational myth for a new Burkina Faso, a narrative that reminded people of what was possible when honor, loyalty, and compassion guided action. Schools taught it as a lesson in both ethics and natural history. Children grew up knowing that their president had been saved by a lion, and that the lion had been saved by their president years before. It became a story about reciprocity, about the bonds that can form across seemingly insurmountable divides. International media coverage of the event had been extensive, and it changed how the world viewed both Burkina Faso and its leader. Here was not just another strong man using force to maintain power, but a man who understood that true strength came from character, not just from weapons. Foreign policy shifted as other nations recognized that Ibrahim's Burkina Faso couldn't be manipulated or intimidated as easily as they had hoped. The assassination attempt and its failure had demonstrated resilience that went beyond military capability. It was a resilience rooted in values, in connection to the land and its people, in a moral framework that couldn't be bought or broken. Years passed. Ibrahim aged as all leaders do. The demands of governance, the weight of responsibility, the endless challenges of steering a nation toward prosperity, all took their toll. His hair grayed, lines deepened around his eyes, but that fundamental strength that had carried him through his darkest night remained. He often walked through the presidential gardens in the early morning hours, before the day's meetings and decisions began. It was in those quiet moments that he felt closest to that night in the forest, to the lessons the lion had taught him. Sometimes he would stand before the bronze statue, remembering every detail, the feel of the ropes cutting into his wrists, the sound of hyenas cackling in the darkness, the warmth of the lion's breath, the intelligence in those golden eyes. "Am I living up to it?" he would whisper to the statue. "Am I being worthy of the second chance you gave me?" The statue, of course, never answered. But Ibrahim would think of his accomplishments. Schools built in rural areas, healthcare extended to the poorest villages, corruption rooted out, though never completely eliminated, that was an eternal fight, foreign exploitation resisted, dignity restored to a people who had been told they were less than others. He thought of the mistakes, too, because leadership inevitably involved difficult choices and imperfect solutions, times when he had to be harsh to prevent greater harm, decisions that saved many but couldn't save all, the compromises required by the messy reality of governance versus the clean simplicity of ideals. But through it all, he tried to hold on to that core lesson: loyalty, honor, courage, and the willingness to stand up for what was right even when it cost dearly. Ibrahim knew he couldn't lead forever. One of his key reforms had been establishing term limits and proper succession mechanisms. No more presidents for life, he had declared early in his tenure. We will build institutions that outlast any individual, systems that serve the people regardless of who holds power. As his final term approached its end, he focused on ensuring that the next generation of leaders understood not just policy and administration, but the deeper principles that should guide their service. He established a leadership academy where promising young people from across Burkina Faso could learn not just technical skills, but ethical frameworks for wielding power. At the academy's inaugural ceremony, Ibrahim told the story of the lion once again, this time to an audience of idealistic young people who would shape their nation's future. That lion could have walked away, he told them. It owed me nothing beyond the life I had saved. It could have chosen self-preservation over loyalty, safety over courage. But it didn't. It stood and fought, not because it would gain anything, but because it recognized a bond, a debt, a relationship that mattered more than comfort or safety. He looked out at the sea of young faces, seeing in them the hope and potential that every new generation brings. You will face moments, he continued, when the easy path is to walk away, when corruption offers rewards, when injustice seems too big to fight, when standing up for what's right means standing alone against many. In those moments, I want you to remember this story. Remember that if a wild animal can choose honor over ease, how much more can you with all your education and opportunity and moral reasoning? A young woman in the front row raised her hand. Mr. President, how do we know when to fight and when to seek compromise? How do we balance idealism with pragmatism? Ibrahim smiled. It was a good question, the kind that showed real thinking rather than just absorption of platitudes. The lion fought when fighting was necessary, he answered. It defended what needed defending. But it didn't pursue the hyenas when they fled. It didn't seek vengeance or dominance for its own sake. There's wisdom in knowing when to stand firm and when to allow retreat. Strength without wisdom is just brutality. Wisdom without strength is just philosophy. You need both. Another student, a young man with intensity burning in his eyes, stood up. But sir, how do we fight systems that are so much bigger than us? Foreign powers, global corporations, entrenched interests, we're just students. What can we possibly do? Ibrahim walked down from the podium and stood directly in front of the young man. I was tied to a tree, he said quietly. Weak, wounded, abandoned by my own soldiers, left to die in the wilderness. I had nothing, no weapons, no communication, no hope. And yet I survived. Not because I was stronger than my enemies, but because I had once done a small act of kindness that created an unexpected alliance. Never underestimate the power of doing the right thing, even when it seems small and pointless. You never know what ripples it will create, what bonds it will forge, what strength it will give you when you need it most. The room was silent. Absorbing this lesson, each of you will face your own wilderness, Ibrahim continued. Your own moment of betrayal, your own night of fear, your own seemingly impossible odds. When that moment comes, and it will come, remember that you are not alone. Remember that bonds of honor and loyalty are real, that courage can inspire courage, that standing up for what's right attracts others who believe in the same things. Be the kind of person worth defending. Live in such a way that if you were tied to a tree, someone or something would choose to save you. In the last year of his presidency, Ibrahim made one more journey to the forest. He was older now, his movements slower, his body bearing the accumulated weight of decades of service and struggle. But he needed to see the place one more time, to close that circle properly before passing power to his successor. His security team insisted on accompanying him, of course. He was still president, still a target for those who opposed his reforms. But he made them promise to stay back, to give him space when the time came. They hiked into the wilderness, and Ibrahim's memory proved remarkably accurate. Even after all these years, he was able to lead them to the exact acacia tree where he had been bound. The ropes were long gone, of course, rotted away or removed by animals. But the tree remained, older and more weathered, but still standing. Ibrahim placed his hand on the rough bark, feeling the texture that had once scraped his back raw. "Hello, old friend," he said to the tree. "Thank you for holding me up that night." His team set up camp 100 meters away, respecting his need for solitude. As night fell, Ibrahim sat with his back against the tree, looking up at the stars through the canopy above. The forest sounds were familiar now, no longer terrifying but almost comforting. He didn't expect to see the lion. That would be too much like a fairy tale, too perfect. The lion was likely dead by now, having lived a full life in the wild. Nature's cycles were unforgiving, and even the mightiest predators eventually fell to age, injury, or younger challengers. But as the moon rose, Ibrahim heard it, a roar in the distance. Not the powerful, earth-shaking roar of a lion in its prime, but something older, deeper, a voice that had known many years and many battles. Ibrahim's heart began to race. Could it be, after all this time? He stood up, ignoring the protests of his aging knees, and walked toward the sound. His security team's radio crackled with concerned voices, but he ignored them. This moment was his alone. In a moonlit clearing, he found a pride of lions. But these were younger animals, in their prime, and in their center, lying with the dignity of an honored elder, was a massive male with a graying mane. Even at a distance, even in the darkness, Ibrahim knew. The scar on the shoulder was still visible. The way the lion held himself, that regal bearing despite age's ravages, was unmistakable. The younger lions noticed Ibrahim immediately, rising to defensive postures. But the old male simply watched. Those golden eyes still sharp despite the years, Ibrahim didn't approach this time. He understood boundaries, understood that he was looking at a grandfather now, a patriarch surrounded by his offspring and their offspring. The lion had lived a full life, had passed on his genes and his strength to a new generation. They looked at each other across the clearing, two old warriors who had shared a night that changed both their lives. No words were needed, no physical contact required. The recognition, the respect, the memory, all of it passed between them in that long look. Ibrahim raised his hand in salute. The lion, as if understanding, rose slowly to his feet, a gesture of respect in return. For a long moment they stood like that, man and beast, united by a bond that had defied all logic and expectation. Then Ibrahim turned and walked back to his camp. He didn't look back. Some goodbyes were better left as they were, clean, honorable, complete. That night, lying in his tent, Ibrahim thought about legacy. Not the political legacy, not the policies and reforms, but the deeper legacy of how one lived, what bonds one created, what kind of person one chose to be. He had been given a gift that night years ago. Not just his life, but a lesson, an example, a standard to aspire to. The lion had shown him that honor wasn't complicated, that loyalty didn't require lengthy philosophies or complex justifications. It was simple. You recognized kindness, you returned it. You made a commitment, you kept it. You saw someone vulnerable, you protected them, not because of what you'd gain, but because it was right. The day came when Ibrahim stood before his nation one last time as president. His successor, a woman he had personally mentored, stood beside him, young, idealistic, but tempered by experience and guided by strong principles. She would continue his work, adapt it to new times and new challenges, build on the foundation he had laid. In his farewell address, Ibrahim spoke not of his accomplishments or his policies, but of the night in the forest, I have told you all this story many times, he said to the assembled crowd and the cameras broadcasting across the nation and beyond. Some of you are probably tired of hearing about the lion. Laughter rippled through the audience. But I tell it again because it is the most important thing I can leave you. Not policies. Policies must change with circumstances. Not institutions. Institutions must evolve as society evolves. What I leave you is a story, a reminder, a standard. He paused, gathering his thoughts. In your lives, you will encounter betrayal. People you trust will disappoint you. Systems you believe in will fail you. There will be moments when you are tied to a tree, figuratively if not literally, abandoned and seemingly without hope. In those moments, remember that darkness is not permanent. Remember that the bonds you forge through kindness and honor will return to you in unexpected ways. Remember that courage attracts courage, that loyalty inspires loyalty, that living with integrity creates allies in places you never imagined. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. Be the kind of person who stops to help a wounded animal even when it's inconvenient. Be the kind of leader who remembers debts and honors commitments. Be the kind of nation that values loyalty, courage, and justice over short-term profit or comfort. These are not old-fashioned values. They are not outdated ethics. They are the foundation of any society worth preserving, any nation worth defending. He turned to his successor. I leave Burkina Faso in capable hands, but more than that, I leave it in honorable hands. That matters more than capability. That matters more than intelligence or education or experience. Honor, integrity, courage. These are what will carry this nation forward. The ceremony concluded with the transfer of power, peaceful and orderly, itself a rarity in the region and a testament to the institutions Ibrahim had built. As he descended from the platform, no longer president but just a citizen, Ibrahim felt lighter than he had in years. Ibrahim spent his remaining years quietly. He wrote a memoir, detailing not just his time as president, but the entire journey, from that night in the forest backward to his childhood and military training, and forward to his vision for Burkina Faso's future. The book became required reading in schools across the nation. He traveled to universities and spoke to students, always willing to share his story and the lessons it taught. He worked with conservation organizations, using his fame to draw attention to wildlife protection. He established scholarships for young people from rural areas, ensuring that opportunity wasn't limited to those born in cities. And sometimes, late at night, he would sit in his modest home, he had refused the lavish retirement package some wanted to give him, and think about the lion. He wondered if the old male was still alive, still watching over his pride with those wise, golden eyes. He wondered if younger lions in that pride carried not just the genes, but somehow the spirit of their noble ancestor. He liked to imagine that they did, that somewhere in the forests of Burkina Faso, there was a lineage of lions that had learned from their grandfather about honor and loyalty, about recognizing kindness and repaying debts. It was a fanciful thought, perhaps unscientific, but it brought him comfort. One of his great-grandchildren, a curious girl of about 8, once asked him, "Papa Ibrahim, did it really happen? The lion, I mean. People at school say maybe it's just a story." Ibrahim smiled at her. This child who would grow up in a Burkina Faso he had helped shape, who would face challenges he couldn't imagine, but would hopefully do so with strong values. "Does it matter if every detail is exactly as I remember?" he asked her. "The important thing is the truth at the heart of it. Kindness returns to you. Loyalty is real and powerful. Courage in defending what's right will inspire others. Those things are true whether the lion was exactly as I described, or whether time and memory have shaped the story. The lesson is what matters." The girl thought about this seriously. "I think it happened," she decided, "because you're the kind of person who would save a wounded lion. And the lion was the kind of lion who would save you back." Ibrahim pulled her into a hug. This wise child who understood what really mattered. "Then that's all that matters," he said. Ibrahim Traoré passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by family and loved by a nation he had served with honor. His funeral was attended by leaders from across Africa and beyond, But the most moving moments came from ordinary citizens who lined the streets as his coffin passed, many wearing lion imagery in tribute. At the exact moment of his funeral, according to reports that would become part of the legend, a roar was heard from the forest. Rangers and conservationists swore that lions across multiple territories roared at that moment, as if the wild itself was saluting one of its own. Was it coincidence? Imagination? The power of collective belief creating perceived reality? No one could say for certain. But the story spread, adding another chapter to the legend of the man and the lion. In the years that followed, Burkina Faso continued on the path Ibrahim had set. There were setbacks, of course. No nation's progress is linear. There were corrupt officials who had to be removed, foreign pressures that had to be resisted, internal divisions that had to be healed. But always, when the nation faced crisis, someone would invoke the story of the lion. Schools would teach it again. Leaders would reference it. And people would remember that courage, loyalty, and honor were possible, were real, were worth striving for. The bronze statue in the capital square became a pilgrimage site. People would come to touch it for good luck, to pray before it in times of trouble, to bring their children to teach them about the values it represented. The patina from thousands of touching hands gave it a warm glow, especially on the figures where people most often made contact, the lion's mane and the man's outstretched hand. Conservation efforts flourished. Burkina Faso's lion population, once endangered, stabilized and began to recover. Ecotourism provided sustainable income for communities living near wildlife areas, giving them a stake in protecting rather than exploiting the animals. International organizations pointed to Burkina Faso as a model for how conservation and development could coexist. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the simplest, a story that reminded people of their better nature. In a world often dominated by cynicism and self-interest, the tale of a man who saved a lion and the lion who saved him back became a beacon. It reminded people that kindness mattered, that loyalty was real, that courage could change outcomes, that honor was not an outdated concept, but a living force that could shape history. Teachers in classrooms across not just Burkina Faso but around the world told the story to their students. Parents told it to their children at bedtime. Leaders referenced it in speeches. Artists painted it, musicians composed songs about it, filmmakers made documentaries exploring it. And in all these retellings, the core message remained constant, that the bonds we forge through kindness and honor will return to us in unexpected ways. That courage attracts courage, that living with integrity creates allies in places we never imagined, and that sometimes in our darkest moments, salvation comes from the most unexpected sources if we have lived in such a way that we deserve it. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and the lion became more than history. It became myth, in the truest and best sense of that word, a narrative that carries truth deeper than mere facts, that teaches lessons transcending specific circumstances, that inspires people across cultures and generations to be better than they might otherwise be. And somewhere, perhaps, in the forests of Burkina Faso, lions still roam, descendants of that noble male who once stood against hyenas and rival prides to protect a helpless human. Whether they carry any memory of their ancestors' covenant is unknowable. But the humans remember. And in that remembering, in that retelling, in that constant renewal of the commitment to honor and loyalty and courage, the covenant lives on. This is the story of how a betrayed leader learned the meaning of true loyalty from a wild predator, how a moment of compassion created a bond that saved a life and inspired a nation, how the wilderness taught lessons that civilization had forgotten, and how sometimes the greatest strength comes not from dominating others, but from recognizing our connections to all life and honoring the debts we owe. It is a story that asks each person who hears it, what kind of person are you? What bonds do you forge? How do you treat those who are vulnerable? And when darkness comes, as it will, what within you will give you the strength to survive and overcome? These are the questions that the story of Ibrahim Traoré and the lion continues to ask, generation after generation. And in answering them, each person writes their own chapter in the ongoing covenant between honor and action, between ideals and reality, between the human and the wild. The covenant endures.